Hello everyone. Today is July 26th and we are starting the second special class of the course States of Exception in Theory and Practice, organized by me, Professor Gasparetto Júnior, as part of Global July 2023, promoted by Federal University of Juiz Fora. I am very glad to receive today Professor Nomi Claire Lazar with the special class Bad Timing, Some Arrhythmias of Climate Emergency. Professor Nomi Claire Lazar is full professor in the uh, graduate School of Public and International Affairs, where she teaches human rights, moral reasoning, and criminal law policy. Professor Lazar's scholarship explores political ethics, crisis government, comparative constitutionalism, and political legitimacy. She has published the States of Emergency in Liberal Democracies and the highly acclaimed Out of Joint, Power Crisis, and the Rhetoric of Time. Professor Lazar, thank you for accepting the invitation and welcome. So the time is all yours. Be free.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. This is such a neat thing you're doing with this course. So hello to all of the students out there. We'll make sure that you get plenty of time to raise your thoughts and comments and questions, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you. So just a few quick preparatory remarks to explain the connection between the reading that I assigned or suggested and the brand new material that I'm going to share with you today in this talk. So I know we have also a mixed audience, different levels of background, etc. So periodically I will try to stop and see if there are any questions or if anyone, make sure everybody's following the argument. Okay, so in terms of the connection between the piece that I had you read and what I'm going to note today. So we study states of emergency for at least two reasons. First, because emergency powers help us to manage dire threats and are themselves a threat, and that presents an interesting and also politically important paradox. And the second reason is that by pointing to the edges of our system of government, we may find a way to call into question how we understand the system as a whole. So those are two kinds of draws that we have to study states of emergency. To understand these questions requires that we take states of emergency not as ontological things that have substantive definitions, as scholars often do, but instead as diverse situations that form part of a more general, complex topography of political life. So power is always plural. It's never ultimate. It's never, the buck never stops anywhere, so to speak. It flows through and around institutions and norms, whether formal or informal. It's always dynamic, it's always moving, it's always changing. So there's nothing essential about emergency. There are only the functions that emergency plays, and those functions are always partly situational. So furthermore, these, like all situations, transpire through time. So to understand the roles that emergency and emergency powers play requires attention both to their diverse political and social functions and to this dynamism in time. So that's the first point. Second, we all know that in politics, it's not just whatever event or challenge leaders face that determines what happens next. It's also the way that people talk about the event or challenge, the way it's framed. So in short, rhetoric matters. Our leaders, our scholars, our pundits, and our own rhetoric. So a key point of the book chapter that I assigned you is that people do politics not just in an emergency, but through the ways that we talk about emergencies. So you and I are doing politics with emergencies right now. In that article, I argued more specifically that scholars who insist the rule of law is a sham on the grounds that emergencies are always a present possibility serve to undermine public commitment to the rule of law. And by undermining that commitment, they help to undermine the rule of law itself. So what we say matters. How we talk about emergency matters. So I want to move from that general insight today to its specific applicability in our current moment, which is to say, as we move deeper into the climate era. So this might be our first El Nino of the climate era, the first year in which almost every human being on the planet is experiencing climate harm firsthand. So the new work I want to present to you today is going to look at the ways that we've come to talk about the climate situation through the language of emergency and the politics that these novel modes of emergency talk generate. This is particularly interesting because lately fears about emergency overreach in the wake of the terror of the knots and teens have given ways to fears of emergency underreach as people start to call for declarations of climate emergency, for the use of emergency power to overrule dithering lawmakers in terms of addressing climate emergency, etc. Indeed, climate language in politics has shifted from change to crisis, and then fairly decisively to emergency in recent years. And perhaps that reflects a sense that time's run out. Certainly, as I said, this year has been pretty extraordinary. We're not sort of looking ahead to climate change now, we're definitely very much in it. So a decade ago, we could speak of it as something that might be averted, and today the frequency and ferocity of revved up weather extremes make evident that the time is now, so to speak. But in what ways is climate an emergency? I'm going to argue that emergency's place in climate discourse should be vastly narrower than it has become. So evidently we need to do something aggressive and well coordinated, but resort to emergency language and action, even with no other open road, would be possibly pointless, and for some of the reasons I laid out in the article I had you read, potentially disastrous. So my hesitancy rests on at least 3 reasons. First, climate emergency declarations, whether they're real or simulacra, often dangerously conflate crisis with emergency, exacerbate dangerous and violent apocalyptic politics while also undermining protections against them, and operate on a politically naive assumption that power is something that ever stops moving. So I'm going to make my case for these claims using a range of temporal lenses. So we'll talk about time and timing and timescapes, rhythms and arrhythmias, alignments and misalignments, which are all underused tools for clarifying conceptual landscapes. Attention to time framing reveals functional distinctions between change, crisis, and emergency. And while that might seem abstract to you initially, concepts are tools, and having sharp, clean tools makes for better work. So the concrete consequences of these arrhythmias are going to grow clear at the end of the talk, where I'll address in turn calls for symbolic and also for actual declarations of climate emergency. And finally, the need for reforms to emergency law and institutions to confront the new rhythms of emergency in the climate age. Emergency powers are going to see ever more action. Given the dangers of frequently using those emergency institutions, some of those dangers I outlined in the article I asked you to read, these institutions need reform to keep accountability in rhythm with the climate crisis cascade. So I do have some slides. Here we go. Just gonna check where. Okay, so can you pass to the next slide? Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's begin with the relationship between change, crisis, and emergency. Climate discourses move from one to the other, and it might seem that these 3 sit on a sort of a spectrum that differs mostly in terms of degree of seriousness, but they actually differ in kind, and here's how. So change is an inherent feature of what is. And crisis, by contrast, is a rhetorical construction of what is. So crisis serves a political function to communicate a value hierarchy that's under threat. But emergency, in turn, is a specific legally constructed response to what is. So here I'm going to be defining emergency functionally. So despite years of scholarly effort, some of which you'll have read for this course, people who try to define emergency's edges ontologically, whether through decision or otherwise, end up having difficulties. So emergency in the salient sense has no ontological status, I would suggest, beyond its legal status, which in turn is defined by reference to necessity. So here's a tidy way to put this. Crises describe endlessly elastic problems to which emergencies only sometimes provide a very specific, time-bound legal solution. So change, crisis, and emergency are thus not matters of degree, but fundamentally different kinds of concepts. Okay, so what is change? Was it ever wise to use the phrase climate change? Everything is changing all the time, after all. Stability is compatible with change because movement often has rhythm. It has a pattern. And that's to say that change can be stable and has always characterized climate, which exhibits rhythms and patterns, El Niños and La Niñas, but also blips and hard turns, little ice ages, and volcanic eruptions that black out the sun, sometimes causing crops and even crowns to fail. So the phrase climate change leaves open a characteristic rhythm of change, a stability in change, and that hardly sounds urgent. What was meant by climate change at the outset was the detection of arrhythmia. So rhythms are spatial patterns that persist through time. Humans seek them everywhere, in part because they generate a certain predictability, which is useful for risk-reducing creatures like us. To recognize a pattern allows us to be prepared for what's next because we can anticipate what comes next. And that's what's driven social science, arguably, for the last 2,000 years at least. So could you change the slide? Thank you. Rhythm recognition sounds sort of calming, but that's deceptive because nature's rhythms, we tend to associate nature with things which are sort of cute and sweet and pure also. But nature's rhythms are maintained through spectacularly brutal cycles of predation and starvation and immolation. So everything we build as human beings is designed to protect us from nature's rhythms, including those that are part of the human species. So when those rhythms change, we need to notice and react quickly. And that means our arrhythmia sensors are always on high alert. That's one reason that our population chart looks like the one on top, where you can see this massive increase in human population around the time of the late Industrial Revolution. This inversion people talk about between that 90% of people who lived in poverty and now the 90% of people who live out of poverty. And this famous chart, which you probably all studied in high school science, of the sort of rhythms of the rabbit population and the fox population, right? So the fact that we're attentive to rhythms may be one reason why those charts look different, at least so far. So there's always a next thing, so to speak. But when the time feels out of joint, as Hamlet says, an increase, whether that's an increase in rhythm speed or a novel direction, risk is harder to manage. But also, and I think this is really important, meaning, which comes from the situation of events in a pattern, can be more difficult to glean as well. So with arrhythmias, danger is often compounded by a sense of moral disorientation, that we're not really sure what is actually happening around us. And that increases the sense of fear and danger. To address the discomfort of arrhythmias, people sometimes look further back, wondering perhaps if the pattern that they crave doesn't begin at T1, but at T-12. So an example of this was that some anthropologists were trying to show that humanity had faced a population bottleneck once before. I think it was something like 60,000 years ago or something, that climate and I think actually a volcanic eruption had resulted in the collapse of the human population to 600 individuals who then became, who are all of our ancestors. So that's an example of sort of trying to look further back for like when the population crashed, what's before, and then it went back up. And so that sort of creates that rhythm for us. Now scientists are saying that probably did not happen, but just this urge that we have to sort of look for, when did this happen before? How can we detect the pattern? Is the sort of safety and meaning-seeking drive that we have. So, but it's critical to remember that all patterns make types of tokens. So no two tokens are actually alike, arguably. It's just that they're similar in a salient way. So change, because of that, is the most elastic thing conceivable. We can pick out patterns any which way just by choosing which things we're going to pick out, right? So we can always sort of find a new pattern and then move on. So calling the climate situation change was, we might say, the original rhetorical sin. It communicated very little about risk and even less about value. Slide. So change in itself, we might say, makes no demands on us, but crisis does. So the shift to the language of crisis made sense. Unlike change, which is a sort of squishy feature of ontology, crisis is always a rhetorical construction. Its function is to communicate value under threat and to demand or legitimate action to protect that value. So the tool that we use for constructing crisis is a rhetorical device that I've called a temporal rhetorical frame. So by a temporal frame, I mean a conception of time's flow that's used to construct or communicate the meaning of specific events. So as risk-engaged creatures, we want to know what a present event or innovation means for the future. Temporal frames provide sort of stock patterns of events that do that narrative job for us. These patterns are drawn from universal aspects of situated and biological human experience and include ideas of progress and decay, linearity and cyclicality, eschatology and primitivism. So scholars often note that political leaders, when they're talking to us, use history at key political moments, but often it's not the history that they're using, i.e. not the content of the events itself, but the narrative shape they trace out that does the rhetorical work. So they're telling not necessarily story X, but the story X is of the type, of a particular type, and so we know what the ending is because we know that type of story, we know that pattern of events, okay, that rhythm of events. So leaders then can construct any number of temporal frames as narrative context for events because there have been an infinite number of events that precede any contested moment. So you can see in the slide here, the sort of dots, like dots on a dot paper. So if you think of those as events, right, and that there's an infinite number of them, you can trace out any line you want by choosing to highlight this event, and this event, and then drawing a sort of a narrative arc line between them. So in that way, you can construct what the present moment means in terms of, you can create it into a crisis precipice. You can insist that now is the moment to build back better. You can demand that now is the moment to make Hungary great again. So a leader picks out and highlights an event set to tell you what a present moment means, or a challenge or an event means. So the temporal frame connects event to event to event, intersecting the current salient moment and continuing on its vector, pointing toward a future that we can expect, basically, that gives us a sense of security, but also a sense of what needs to be done. So I'm sure some of you might be able to think of some examples from your home country, rhetoric where you live, and I would love for you to put those in the chat for me to have a look at after. In the interest of time now, I'll continue, but I would love to have a look at those after. So the intellectual history of crisis can help illuminate how crisis rhetoric specifically makes use of temporal framing. Crisis has had two distinct meanings. Here I'm drawing on the work of Koselleck. So the Greeks used it to denote the moment of decision, where things could go either way. A decision in the face of crisis is a judgment, which creates determination and shapes the world. So from this reactive, creative conception of crisis that we get from the Greeks, we derive the word critique, something which judges, something which decides. But crisis is also conceived as indecisiveness, as a dissonance or disorder that stretches out in the elastic space before a decision. So Koselleck draws an analogy to a court case. The legal process is a period of tension. There are facts and fact-finding, possibilities and threats. There's the promise of a harmony to come, but there's not yet a resolution. There's not yet a restoration of justice or order. We persist in this sort of state of dissonance and tension and expectation, and we wait for the decision. We know it's coming, but the decision is not yet. So crisis plays on this discomfort, this tension, this expectation of the not yet. It's the rhetorical construction of an arrhythmia, which demands, but may not get resolution. By tracing out this arrhythmia through a chain of events, crisis talk creates that sense of discomfort, urgency and tension. So this rhetoric identifies a deviation, the outlier event, which marks a sort of a fork in the road. So one fork leads back to order, back to right rhythm, and the other leads over a cliff. That is, crisis rhetoric asserts that what is happening now is not a change in rhythm or a shift reflecting a longer term rhythm. It's a break in rhythm. It's the construction of that shift as a break that creates the sense of crisis, the looming precipice that demands action now. So the crisis frame constructs the moment as the last turn or the last chance, or the last change. In one sense, ultimacy claims like these are always true, since patterns and rhythms are abstractions of types from tokens, as I've said. So there's sort of an organization of the manifold. So types of events, not token events, make rhythms. So it's summer once more if you're in the northern hemisphere, and winter once more if you're in the southern, but it's never the same summer or winter twice. So the precipice to the future is always, in that sense, the present moment. Every moment has crisis potential. But in another sense, true crisis exists for most of us exactly once, at the moment of our death. Even then, this framing depends on a conception of self. After all, the matter of which we're comprised, including the trillions of microorganisms who help constitute us, return to the earth and find their way back into nitrogen and water cycles, etc. So put another way, crises are never actually the last thing, the last chance before the precipice. Time moves on and carries with it events. So to bastardize Rilke, no crisis is final. Something always happens next. Crises are never natural kinds and always rhetorical constructions. So change is a fact, we might say, and crisis is a construction. Slide. So this might sound sort of cold because real people, mothers, children, friends, are already suffering and dying in the climate crisis. Some of you may know some of them, given the number of people who have already died this year from climate-related disasters. Am I diminishing the force of this visceral fact by reducing crisis, including climate crisis, to a rhetorical construction? Actually, what I want to suggest is the contrary. So crisis serves precisely to construct this moral force. That is, people rhetorically construct crises to specifically communicate hierarchies of value. It's not the value which is constructed through this rhetoric, but rather the means of that value's communication. So the value can be genuine, and the construction of crisis allows us to communicate that. So change becomes crisis through designation of a threat to key values. That a state is of ultimate value makes war a crisis. That are, that's the reason why states who are invaded don't just capitulate. That our compatriots and loved ones are of ultimate value constructs the opioid crisis as a crisis. And that humans want to live on Earth in a manner different from all other animals, in comfort, civility, and relative safety, is what renders the climate situation a crisis. So thinking back to that slide with the population charts, right? So if we didn't think that it was if we thought that it was fine for our population chart to do the same thing that the rabbit one and the fox one do, then it wouldn't be a crisis. It's because we think that our population should not collapse because we are different from all other animals that it becomes a crisis. So activists love crisis because it casts the most extreme moral aspersions on any leader who doesn't act. How dare you not act in the face of this crisis? And leaders love crisis because the person who transforms that agonizing and morally ultimate sense of not yet into the moment when is the hero. The temporal frame creates the crux. The ultimate value creates the urgency, the sense that there's no choice but to. So I'm going to pause here for a second and just, is there anyone who's not following the argument who needs a little help, or are we doing all right? Well, it looks like I can't see the chat.
Yeah, Professor, we are doing all right.
Okay, so we'll continue then. Okay, so used sparingly, the crisis frame might hold immense rhetorical power. So after all, crisis frames structure a lot of our cross-culturally most beloved epics and adventures. So we have this sort of catharsis thing we do with these sorts of stories in which a protagonist confronts a crisis, engages in a sort of collective striving, perhaps led by a certain kind of actor, someone strong and rapid and decisive. So often the actor is, or wisely takes the advice of, some kind of technocrat or seer in the structure of this story. Maybe an epidemiologist, maybe Gandalf, who knows precisely what to do. So then after some struggle, good prevails, and then finally, with everyone exhausted, rhythm, sometimes modified, is restored. So whatever special license that a leader takes in those stories, they put down, they put their powers down, and normalcy returns. So Cincinnatus puts down his sword and picks up his plow. So I'm not sure if that's something that you've thought about, but these, but basically the story of emergency powers and the rhythm of emergency powers is often also the rhythm of, or I should say of crisis, properly speaking, is often also the rhythm of our favorite stories, right? But the problem is that crisis rhetoric is a bit like a drug to which we've become habituated. So we aren't hobbits who live in the Shire, where nothing much happens most of the time, but people who are always drowning in crises, a braid of crisis, a Russian doll of crisis, if you will. Migrant crises and drug crises and debt crises and gun crises and healthcare crises and climate crises and pandemic crises, and on and on and on. So we become habituated to this constant talk of urgency, and that means maybe we need a stronger dose. And maybe this is where and why the language of crisis morphs into cries that the climate situation is not just a crisis, but a state of emergency. So both crisis and emergency sit together in this sort of neighborhood of urgency and sometimes of ultimacy with resulting high stakes. But there's no ontological continuity which corresponds to this rhetorical development in the way that we talk about the climate. So emergency is not simply a more serious crisis. Rather, emergency in the salient sense and crisis are distinguished in at least two ways. Slide. Thank you. So first, emergency in the politically salient sense is a technical, legal construction, while crises are constructed rhetorically. And further, emergency is defined implicitly or explicitly in relation to distinct kinds of functions. By the way, I should point out here that if, because you're all students who are interested in states of emergency, that if you've been reading a lot of theory and you haven't been paying a lot of attention to empirical law, case law, empirical case studies of how emergency power actually works in practice in different contexts, then you must do this if you want to make sense in whatever you go on to write or do. So good theory, useful theory is empirically informed. So consider how crises and emergencies come into existence through distinct kinds of speech acts. So anyone can construct a crisis rhetorically. A rhetorically constructed crisis may then persist in the absence of decision, in the absence of action, even in the absence of any possibility for decision or action. But emergency in the legal sense comes into existence through a proclamation that meets very specific legal criteria. So we might say a crisis is to a declaration of love, as an emergency is to a contract of marriage. The first imparts a certain moral understanding of a situation and sometimes also moral duties. The second legally alters rights, powers, and constraints. Now, there's, of course, also an ordinary language sense of emergency, which is roughly synonymous with crisis, but this is not the sense in which emergency tends to be used in some of this climate discourse. The aim of climate emergency discourse is to shape the conduits of power. That means we're dealing here with the formal sense of emergency. It's in part the conceptual confusion that arises between these ordinary and technical senses of emergency which drives the problem. So second, crises and emergencies have distinct political characters. A crisis is a situation where action is urgently required, but for a range of reasons has not been taken. Maybe the crisis is too vastly complex. So in Canada here, we have a housing crisis, and it is vastly complex, and people are trying, but maybe not in the right ways, or maybe not hard enough, or maybe not with enough commitment. The situation is complex. So we know it's a crisis. It hasn't been solved yet, in part because of its complexity. Or the tools are out there, but not the political will. So that could also be the case with the housing crisis. Or recalling that crisis involves rhetorical framing geared toward communicating value, sometimes inaction in the face of a crisis is due to political contestation over values. But by contrast, an emergency is defined in part by the impossibility of addressing the situation through existing means, together with the reasonable probability that the situation can be addressed were government to use special legal means. That is, emergency relates to necessary tools to address all or part of a crisis. Sometimes this is actually made explicit in legislation. When Canada's Emergencies Act, for example, makes clear that in order to declare a state of emergency, there must be, the law says, no other law of Canada capable of engaging the crisis, and that the governor and council must have reasonable, reviewable grounds to believe that emergency powers are necessary. But this criterion of necessity is always there in emergency law in some form, even if implicitly. So it can't be necessary to declare an emergency unless it is reasonable to expect that the declaration has the functional capacity to make a difference to the crisis at hand, and to expect that the jurisdiction declaring the emergency has the intention to exercise that capacity. This language of necessity is key. A public emergency properly exists only because its existence is necessary. Not all public threats, not all crises are public emergencies, because not all threats require, nor would benefit from, the very specific public powers enabled by a state of emergency. Urgency is critical too, as otherwise passing legislation in the normal way is possible. It is because crisis demands action now, and because emergency powers can sometimes do the job, that they exist at all. Slide. Here we return, oh no. What happened was, so I used software in PowerPoint to make this beautiful graph, but it's been converted into a very different kind of thing. But that's okay. So you can just go to the next slide. And that's too bad. It was a beautiful slide, and you're all going to miss it. But life goes on. So here we're going to return to the question of temporal framing. The temporal boundaries of emergency are defined in law, ideally justified on the grounds of reasonableness and then judged in practice. But those temporal boundaries are defined by functional necessity, which in a rule of law regime can have objective, reviewable elements. But emergency has no further ontological character. Emergency is the period of time during which the use of certain tools and measures is necessary. But it's situated in undulations of preparation and deliberation and accountability through time. So it's not, so what this slide was meant to show was, these sort of peaks that, where the arrows are still pointing here, that come above the water or whatever, and we say, oh, the emergency starts here at the beginning of this peak above the water and then ends here. But all around that, the mountain, we could say, sort of descends further into the water, as there, almost every jurisdiction has extensive emergency management infrastructure that is prepared long before the crisis takes place, right? And then after the crisis takes place, there are processes of reflection, maybe commissions of inquiry that process and digest what happened in the emergency and what could be done differently afterward. So emergencies look like they're sort of confined in time, but they actually exist in these sort of long temporal undulations. Crisis, by contrast, has temporal bounds that are permanently elastic and entirely divorced from the possibility of, never mind the necessity for decision or action, resolution or success. So crisis rhetorically constructs the problem to which emergency is only sometimes a partial solution. So crisis and emergency are not temporally aligned. Okay, slide. Now, in light of these distinctions and relations between change and crisis and emergency, let's revisit 3 situations in which climate and emergency have found themselves paired in recent years, and consider where we might garner some clarity. Okay, so we've got some theoretical structure here. Now let's look at these more concrete situations. So the first are climate emergency declarations. So many of you might be familiar with these, certainly there's been a very strong movement over the last 4 or 5 years for jurisdictions that range from municipalities up to the highest levels of government across the world to declare a state of climate emergency, okay? And this movement has been growing, or at least was until very recently, and maybe it got some energy from COVID when a lot of people came to associate states of emergency with a government intention to put an issue first above all else and deal with it aggressively. But these calls for declarations of climate emergency have really unsettled a lot of emergency power scholars who remember that emergency powers have had other terrible uses. Some note that it's not just urgency, but the sudden and temporary character of events that renders emergency powers necessary. And then they point out that we've had decades of warning about this particular precipice. So the climate situation is urgent, yes, but it's hardly sudden. So some scholars say, well, we shouldn't be using the language of emergency here because it doesn't map on temporally. Others worry that the declarations are vague, invoking ideas of crisis and urgency without concrete commitments. And as Professor Jocelyn Stacey, my colleague, has noted, climate emergency declarations are actually not declarations of emergency at all. So jurisdictions are not using the formal declaratory procedures made possible under emergency legislative or constitutional provisions, nor are they, to my knowledge, registering with the UN their derogation intentions under Article 4 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as they would be required to do if they're a state party and they were making a declaration of emergency. So these statements that jurisdictions are making are simulacra of states of emergency with a primarily communicative or symbolic purpose. And that's not nothing, as Professor Stacey notes, because of course symbolic communication matters, and it may generate coordinated activity in the right direction, at least in the short term. But recent qualitative research on what changed in jurisdictions after these kinds of declarations suggests that politicians who make these declarations often have very little idea what the declaration they just made actually means. They're maybe intended to jolt a flatlining heart back into rhythm, but no one seems sure how this is actually meant to function. And furthermore, the jolt might be insufficient. And then there are other arrhythmias, an arrhythmia between attention and issue span that may make calls for emergency declarations, lacks symbolic power, call that into question. So people attend to emergency immediately due to short-term, clear and present dangers, but climate impacts different people differently and at different times. And these challenges will be around and constantly shifting for a long time to come. So that's another arrhythmia. And just as people become habituated to constant crisis, they could become habituated to states of emergency too. So I'm sure most of you or many of you know that there are a lot of jurisdictions that have lived under states of emergency for decades with not that much attention. And I don't just mean Egypt and Israel. There are currently 79 federal states of emergency in force in the United States, for example. Few Americans know, and even fewer seem to care. So how much can be achieved in this short burst of attention that an emergency declaration would garner? And some people might say, well, better something than nothing. And some jurisdictions in that recent empirical research did report a sort of increased level of action, and that is something. But these declarations, which are not declarations, come at a cost. So in mimicking legal forms, they generate dangerous confusion and invite a proliferation of emergency calls to mirror the proliferation of crises. So I'll just tell a quick anecdote to illustrate this confusion. So as some of you may be aware, in Canada, there is a terrible crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people who are vastly more likely to be murdered or to disappear. And so recently a member of Parliament called on Parliament to issue a declaration of emergency around missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. And this generated, so I was then contacted by a journalist from the national broadcaster asking whether this declaration met the legal standard in the federal legislation. And she said she had been talking to members of Parliament who didn't seem to know or to understand what they had just done. So even the lawmakers themselves didn't understand somehow that this declaration of an emergency was not, in fact, a legal declaration of emergency, or what the difference might be. And so while I do not in any way mean to diminish the seriousness of the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people, there's some question around whether it is sort of escalated, well, so the appearance of escalation to a state of emergency from a crisis, when in fact a state of emergency is a separate type of thing, may create confusion that actually has a kind of a backlash effect rather than effectively addressing the problem. In addition, when we normalize emergency rhetoric as opposed to crisis rhetoric, then when there is a technical legal emergency, the citizens might not know the difference. They might not give proper attention to demands for compliance that put people's lives at risk, for example. And this will grow only harder and harder if people, including apparently our own lawmakers, can't distinguish legal from other forms of emergency declaration. Could you change the slide? Thanks. So then there are those who want more than a symbolic declaration. So some people see in the state of emergency a means of unlocking super strong executive powers to combat interests that disrupt necessary climate measures. So we all know that there are a number of different barriers. There are, there's greed and selfishness. There's temporal discounting, where people would rather have the comfort of their car this week than think about the consequences of that further down. There's buck passing. There's sense of hopelessness. There's selfishness. There's exhaustion. There are all kinds of things that are keeping our democratically elected governments from addressing the climate issue. So some people say, well, what we really need to do is sort of get around all those special interests, get around the oil companies, get around people's recalcitrance, and just give the power to the executive who can get the job done, right? So put a little fire in the executive's guns and use an actual legal state of emergency to make the changes that need to be made for the climate crisis. So there are two arrhythmias that make such calls especially dangerous. So first, there's the old argument about the permanent state of emergency. So an arrhythmia of temporal scope, you might say. So the climate situation is urgent, but is neither sudden nor temporary. So these elements also are not arbitrary. So they delineate the function of emergency powers by which emergency is defined. So to call the function of emergency powers by which, so to call for an actual legal climate emergency is to refuse to make law in the normal way, not because democracy can't, like not because there's no time, but because democracy won't. So real emergency powers are out of joint with the rhythm of climate emergency in that way. And because the climate situation isn't going anywhere, there's no end in view, and then it's emergency powers all the way down, so to speak. So the second arrhythmia is caused by the illusion that political patterns stop with the achievement of power. And this reflects a two-pronged temporal naivety. The first assumes a process politics that can handle politics of ultimacy. And the second actively seeks a politics of ultimacy and fails to notice that there's no such thing. So people imagine in democracy, or they imagine that democracy with its sort of trappings of self-governance is a primarily intrinsic value, that we want democracy because we want to have our say, that we think self-government is a form of freedom, etc. And all of that is true. But we should not forget, strategically or otherwise, that its original function is the mediation of contesting apocalyptic politics based on opposed conceptions of existential threat. So that's why democracy was originally born. So if you sort of cast your minds back to the starvation, predation, fear, and disorder of the wars of religion in Europe, for example, when losing a battle for power meant losing everything, then everything was awful. And we have very short memories about this. So to respond to this threat, constitutional democracies were designed with a temporal orientation toward process, right? So there's always the next election, the next round of policy making. There's always more time. No decision is final, and that lowers the stakes of competing visions of the good. By contrast, a politics that's temporally oriented toward finality, toward ultimacy, a sort of politics of once and for all, has an apocalyptic character that generates a vicious cycle. So the higher the stakes get, the more polarized and extreme the politics grow. One side's perception that it's now or never, that everything's at stake, forces the other side into an equal but opposite posture. Then when the stakes seem existential, the future of the planet, the future of a culture, adhering to the slow, stable political system's rules may come to seem irrational. I mean, who cares about democracy when we are about to go extinct on this view? But without democracy, what buffers this contest of competing ultimacies? So further driving this retrenchment into extremes are expected reactions to any authoritarian emergency politics that some might try. So here, the COVID emergency holds important lessons for long-term emergency. Even where there were majority-supported emergency actions, such as in Canada, where about 2/3 of Canadians continue to support government action restrictions around COVID, others got bored and also suffered a great deal because of those restrictions, and then they got angry and then they resisted. So already the mainstreaming of extremism is partly a consequence of the climate situation, which the aggressive use of emergency powers could exacerbate further. So we have to remember that there are reactions to things, right? So democracy's intransigence makes climate action harder, yes. So we move slower, then we have all of these things I talked about before in terms of greed and temporal discounting, etc. But democracy's intransigence is necessary to manage these compounding intertwined threats of political extremism. Oh, I should probably make clear, I do not mean to suggest that everyone who reacted to climate restrictions was an extremist. That obviously is a small subset, just that it's an important subset. The use of emergency power over anything beyond the shortest time frame will feed that small subset, however, while simultaneously stifling the best means of moderating it. Back we go then to the war of all against all. So scholars would do well to keep this in mind in the face of arguments that take the call for emergency powers to its natural conclusion. So if climate is existential, and if we can't stop it, the climate from changing, and if it's at least approximately permanent, and if authoritarian power is necessary to address the situation, then the same argument for a functionally defined legal state of emergency to address climate right now might support permanent authoritarian power. But what makes us think that politics will end once an authoritarian power constellation is put into place to manage climate? Everyone thinks that, or everyone who's sort of in favor of authoritarian power seems to think that it will be used for the ends that they think are best, because they frame the moment at which power is theirs as the last moment. So they construct their own politics of ultimacy, but there's always the next moment. So to abuse Rilke once again, we might say, no power is final. A moment later, people with quite different ideas about what counts as existential for humanity would be at work to seize that power, and they will fight to the death to get it. After all, power contests are, without the buffer of constitutional democracy, now literally existential. Even climate change activists don't share among themselves an understanding of what's needful, just to put this in context. So yes, there's Greta, but there are also eco-fascists and green anarchists who see the end of civilization as something that's actively desirable as a form of purification. So will the climate crisis solution espoused by our new overlords include selective depopulation, which is to say genocide or breeding programs? This is certainly not what scholars who are advocating sort of temporary authoritarianism to deal with the climate situation would endorse. But once those tools are on the table, who says it will be they, those scholars, who decide? So democratic politics is a politics of process. It's a politics of endless time. And while that slows things endlessly as well, even when speed is of the essence, any politics of ultimacy is ultimately a politics. So is there even an argument for climate emergency powers in the first place, we might ask? If emergency power is justified only when necessary, and necessary only when there exists no functional alternative, then what is lacking is not necessarily the legal tools to get the job done, nor the time to do so. Rather, it's a cohesive, across society's diverse sectors, across jurisdictions, across the world, political will. There are tools available if leaders would use them. So power is not the problem. Globally coordinated political will is the problem. So let's not be polite about how authoritarian governance works or fails to work. Those advocating for the use of real legal emergency power to bypass democratic dithering on climate are advocating for emergency power in the tradition of Weimar Article 48, which is to say, not because the tools aren't available in regular law, and not because there is no time to pass a new law, but because the people need to take their bitter medicine and must be forced to take it. So maybe we must. But I've suggested caution around climate emergency declarations, which conflate the distinct functions of and temporal horizons of crisis and emergency. And I'm also urging caution around emergency climate governance, both because of the democracy-killing temporal horizon of ultimacy and because there's still politics the moment after. There's always the power after. Could you change the slide? Oh, sorry, and one more. Thanks. So with all this said, and regardless of what one thinks of climate emergency in these other senses, there's no denying that the rhythm and timing of actual functional emergencies is changing. Our existing legal and constitutional powers were designed to address discrete intermittent crises. So yes, those mountaintops that you didn't get to see kind of rest on foundations and undulations and valleys that go on under the water, so to speak. But we might say that those peaks, right, that poke up above the water are going to be doing so rather more regularly. So our existing legal and constitutional powers are designed for those discrete intermittent crises, but it's almost like that landmass, you could think of the Himalayas, right, being pushed up between the continents. There are going to be a lot more peaks soon. So humanity is facing an immediate cascade of climate-sparked emergencies. So the floods and infernos, the ice storms and tornadoes that are ripping us with increasing regularity are going to face institutions that are not up to the job. They're not ready. So when I was beginning to work through some of these thoughts and ideas, I did so amid thick smoke. And even now, a lot of Canada is still literally on fire. The same, of course, is true in Europe. There are a lot of legal states of emergency in force simultaneously, and many of the laws that are in force are archaic, lacking the most basic safeguards or oversights. And this is true of emergency law in most of the world's jurisdictions. So as climate drives a cascade of interrelated and mutually reinforcing crises, natural, political, economic, etc., it seems likely that political complexity will invite the abuse of those archaic powers still on the books in most jurisdictions. So we, in those jurisdictions, we've tended to rely on sort of informal constraints to check abuse. We may not be able to rely on that anymore. So if one thing is urgent, it's attention to the black letter law in different jurisdictions to make sure that the best available safeguards, up-to-date safeguards, are in place as we move into this era of much more frequent use of emergency law. So even sound emergency laws with good accountability often envision reversion to stability, right? So this is another problem that we have to attend to in black letter law. So for example, Canada's Federal Emergencies Act assumes that there's going to be a long period of calm after that law is used, where reasoned parliamentary debate can take place. So even a full year of calm, including political calm, for a public inquiry. But we may not have that space anymore when emergency laws are used. We may not have that leisurely pace. So it's past time for both of those reasons for legal reform across the world. The history of crisis governance suggests that emergency law that's made on the fly puts democracy and the rule of law in greater danger. We want calm heads to be thinking this stuff through. So of the many just transitions that we have to confront in the climate age, economic, social, etc., a just legal transition to new kinds of emergency frameworks can't be overlooked because the rule of law may well depend on it. So as we approach these challenges, I urge you to remain super conscious of the way that we're all talking about emergency. Rhetoric, framing, and persuasion have always sat at the core of politics. We might say that words are like stakes that bolster our positions, but also steady the rule of law and help discourse to grow and flourish. But where the heart of democracy has already grown a bit rotten, those same stakes can be used to deal a death blow. So on that note, I will stop. You can switch to the final slide. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments. I know this has been a bit, or maybe a bit provocative. So so tell me how and why, and let's get into this. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Nomi Claire Lazar. It was amazing and very provocative, as you commented it would be. Amazing. We are very satisfied with your provocative ideas. Well, so now we have time to some questions and comments, but before I would like to inform the students, especially because there was a mistake with the attendance list and some people signed the wrong attendance list. So please, who signed it, sign again, because now it's the correct link in the chat. Well, we have time to talk a little with Professor Lazar, and I would like to start with some commentaries and a question about what you mentioned. Well, the ideas were very provocative with this comparison between crisis and the state of emergency, and you are a very specialist in that case of state of emergency. But we have a current problem that is the climate change that is worrying everyone. I would like to ask you, Professor, as a first question to start our debate after the class. What do you think about the effects of the climate change? You touched on that idea during your talk about democracy, but do you think that climate change can develop or spread states of exception in liberal democracies and change them?
I think that is one highly probable outcome, in part because we've seen that the climate issue has become has become sort of aligned with the most extreme kinds of political polarization. So we know that views on climate change are or tend to come along with views, sort of more conspiratorial views, for example. So people who doubt climate change also tend to think that there's a conspiracy that's sort of pushing the climate change narrative, for example. And so the sorts of issues that are causing the most profound polarization that's sort of tearing at the fabric of our democracies are sort of tied up with people's positions on the climate. So to the extent that it then becomes a trigger for reaction when a state attempts to address the climate situation, that we could sort of see this becoming a bit of a spiral potentially. And we would want our democracy, democracies can handle a lot, but we would want to start out with a strong democracy, a strong civil space, in order to be able to handle those sorts of shocks. And then there's the fact that our way of life is going to change one way or another, and we would have to be very nimble to shift that way of life in such a way that was sort of constructive enough and kind of mutually supportive enough that that are sort of dancing around kind of apocalyptic visions and things here. I don't think we do have to sort of leap to the apocalyptic, but so I've been very long-winded here. I guess in a nutshell is things are going to change faster and faster now. And if we aren't nimble enough in making sure that those transitions are just, then there's going to be action reaction, and it could very well tear the fabric of our democracies apart.
So another point here is that when we think about the states of exception, we tend to think that they are more a problem than a solution to problems in political societies. In your book, States of Emergency in Liberal Democracies, the title says something, that they are present in liberal democracies. And I would like to request from you now some more comments about that idea that you developed in that book to our students, please.
Okay, so it does seem to me that states of, well, so first of all, the first comment you made that we used to be worried about states of emergency being these terrible things we have to avoid, and that now there are these calls for more and more declarations of emergency, I do think that's a really interesting moment that scholars of emergency need to pay attention to. Why is this happening? How should it, should it make us think differently about emergency powers, and if so, how? But then, so in the book, I argue that emergencies and the powers to address them are not a pathology of liberal democracy. They're not something that goes wrong with liberal democracy, but rather that every constitutional regime has institutions which are inherently flexible, has a multiplicity of norms that sometimes are in conflict with each other, and that we should understand emergency as part of the topography of power and the topography of liberal democratic norms, that there's a certain continuity across normalcy and states of emergency, and therefore that we should be very cautious about calling these states of exception, so to speak, because in practice that's not how they work. So the law is not silenced during a state of emergency. Things may shift. They may shift in sequence. They may shift in limits, for example. But the law does not disappear in a state of emergency, and that it's normal also to have different values that are conflicting with each other. Even the same value can conflict if we think about sort of rights conflicting, for example. So the fundamental argument in that book is that that we should not conflate states of emergency with states of exception, because there are always value conflicts and there are always power conflicts, and that power works both in formal ways and in informal ways. So we're always constraining informal power and using with formal mechanisms, but also using informal constraints on formal power in a state of emergency. So it's not like someone declares an emergency and then they can do whatever they want. That there are still constraints. They just might be more informal. So a state of emergency is not a state of exception. It's not the silencing of law. It's just a shifting of the way that powers and norms relate to each other.
Excellent. And one more thing, I would like to return to the point of climate change to connect to the class that we had yesterday, when Professor Matthias Lenk presented some aspects of states of exception caused by man-made causes and non-man-made causes. We can think about the non-man-made causes creating problems or political consequences in our lives, when we think about the case of the pandemic, for example, COVID-19. COVID-19 was an event of a crisis that developed some repercussions in the world, but the climate change is something that will last longer in the world, because we are in this process for a while. This is a non-made cause to an emergency or to a rhetorical comprehension of a crisis or explanation of a crisis. Is there, in case of the pandemic of COVID-19, we have some examples of threats to democracy that were related to the pandemic, this non-made cause. And in case of climate emergency, is there already any empirical example in the world of democracy that was constrained or affected by the aspects of climate change?
Okay, so I'll do this in reverse order. I want to contest the idea that we can cleanly separate human-caused from non-human caused emergencies. But first, so are there examples of sort of climate politics kind of pressing on the democratic process? I suppose that, so there's certainly examples so an example from Canada. So our current Prime Minister was elected partly on a platform of aggressive climate measures. And this was taken as a great threat in those parts of the country that that are rich off oil, basically, that this was going to be a personal or a collective attack on them and their way of life. And so there were certain there are scholars who have sort of traced a line between some aggressive and increasingly extreme movements of reaction against the current government to that very fact that sort of the funding for some of these things, that the impetus for some of these things came from a perceived threat to the oil industry in Canada. So that would be an example. Then I do think more generally the alignment between sort of conspiratorial thinking around climate change and other extreme positions forms a threat to democracy, just as part of that whole package, which could be exacerbated as governments hopefully do make moves to address climate change. Then, so I'd say that those are some concrete examples of where democracy has been impacted already. And just for context, when I say that, I'll leave it at that. But I do want to contest this notion that we could, and of course I didn't hear the talk yesterday, so I may be getting this wrong. But contest the notion that we could cleanly separate out emergencies or crises that are made by, or actually I want to stick with emergencies here, that are made by humans versus have some natural source. And the reason for that is that an emergency is never just the event itself. It's always a combination between the event itself and our capacity to respond to it. So if you have an earthquake and the roads get ripped up, but you're set up in such a way that emergency services can still reach people without roads for whatever reason, maybe you're in Amsterdam and you can use canals or something. Don't know if they get earthquakes there. Then you have a crisis, right? Like you have a bad situation, but you don't necessarily have a state of emergency because the resources exist to respond to that situation. So a state of emergency should it only takes place when the usual means of managing the situation are no longer available or aren't sufficient. So the ambulance can't get to you because of the roads are ripped up, or the disease can't be contained in the normal kinds of ways. So an emergency is always arises in part because of political decisions about resource use, for example, that came before the emergency and how that interacts with the situation at hand. So some people have pointed, for example, to Singapore's response to the COVID crisis, because Singapore, in the wake of the SARS crisis, had built this sort of purpose-ready, they basically had a whole system in place, they had all kinds of resources, and they were ready to go. And as a result, in the first year of the COVID crisis, the excess deaths were actually lower, like there were fewer deaths than normal in Singapore. And so this is this idea that it's not just that there was a disease, it's the level of preparation that the state had, the readiness of the state to deal with this situation. And it only becomes an emergency when the situation surpasses the state's capacity to address the situation in the normal way. And once you look at it like that, it's always a combination between external factors and political or like human-made factors. So I just want to put that on the table.
Thanks, Professor Lazar. We have a question from the student Samuel Souza. He asks, Professor Lazar, some Brazilian authors have discussed an environmental collapse instead of an environmental crisis. What do you think of the first term?
Well, that's quite interesting. So I guess you could argue that the terms collapse and crisis are parallel, because they both sort of invoke the idea of a sort of a point, of a single point that's of a precipice, right? So that there's a point at which the thing collapses, or there's a point at which you fall off the edge of the crisis cliff. So in those ways, they're sort of parallel, but collapse is different rhetorically, I think, in the way that it implies that like a sort of a failure that's already taken place. So and it implies a sort of a lack of, well, no, I guess that would still be parallel to the crisis thing. But collapse invokes the end point, whereas crisis invites an opportunity to avert the end point, I would say. But I'm not sure. I would actually be quite interested if Samuel would tell me what you think. Do those two seem parallel to you? And when authors in Brazil talk about those two terms, do they seem interchangeable to you, or what would you see as the difference? Is there a mechanism that Samuel can use to answer?
Yes. Samuel can continue his commenting on via chat, okay? But while he writes that he will probably answer you, I will share the comment of Maria Gabriela Carvalho that posted here a long comment that is very interesting. I have a comment actually. Your speech made me think about a video I saw this week about a Brazilian psychanalyst, Maria Homem, talking about the political situation here in Brazil and how our thinking is tied to an idea of a certain political father who would save the country. And reading the text you assigned for today and listening to your speech, I think this is what people need to pay attention to when they call for a state of emergency or exception, because it seems that contrary to what I understood yesterday, the state of exception is not a situation in which law is ignored or overridden. And you give lots of examples in the paper. And she finishes, but actually this thinking that power should be given to a single person, which you call populism tyranny, because the democratic system allegedly can't handle things is an actual threat. Sorry, this last part it was bad. So I repeat here. But actually, this thinking that power should be given to a single person, which you call populism tyranny, because the democratic system allegedly can't handle things, is an actual threat. So this is a commentary of Maria Gabriela Carvalho. Would you like to comment?
Oh, just to say that I'm glad that the students are getting these quite distinct perspectives, these different ways of framing things up, because you could make arguments on both sides, and it's good to see that contrast. But yes, I do think that those calls for sort of a strong authoritarian leader to kind of solve the situation are the type of thing that I'm talking about as a threat. Because if you think that liberal democracy, so in the article that I assigned, if you think that liberal democracy is just a sham anyway, that the whole thing is constructed only for the benefit of certain people or whatever, then why would you bother preserving that? So you have to see the value in it. If you think it's a sham, yes, why would you fight for it? Why would you resist tyranny? You would just want the tyrant, the best tyrant available. So I do think that's and I think it's interesting in part also because there are increasing calls among environmentalists for this same kind of thing, right? Like give the executive the power that's needed to fix the situation. That if only we had a strong daddy who could save us, kind of thing. So we have to be very conscious about that stuff, for sure. Thanks, Maria.
Well, so continuing the commentary of Samuel Souza, he said, I see a difference between the terms when you think of collapse. I see the possibility of depletion and non-renewal of environmental resources, for example. And when we talk about crisis, we think about the possibility of renewing existing resources on the planet. A Brazilian author named André Vilar Gomes discusses about these issues that he brought up in the chat.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's how it sounds to me too. That collapse sounds hopeless, and crisis sounds like there's still a chance. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you, Samuel.
Very well. And before we finish, Professor, I would like to ask you another thing. And what can you think about the position of climate change or the situation of climate change? Because we are talking about emergency, crisis, state of exception. And when we think about the political life or the societies in this, what we would call the pattern situation or the standard situation, what is the importance of climate to the next generations of liberal democracies in your perspective?
I mean, these questions are very difficult because I just have this sense that we're still not fully understanding what's happening around us, and that it's speeding up, and that there are going to be that our physical surroundings may change so rapidly that, and given that all those things are, interconnected, the social, the condition of the land, resources, the political, economic, etc., that it's really hard to. I'm very skeptical of any prediction, positive or negative, and very loath to say anything more than I think that there's a serious threat, and I think that there will be change, that we're not going to be able to persist in the way that we are. But beyond that, I'm very hesitant to say more, just because things are changing already so fast, just this year compared to last year, for example. More and more people will die faster and faster, and I do think this might be the first year that almost no one was untouched by some element of climate change in terms of their kind of domestic situation, whether it was extreme weather of one kind or another. So that will have an impact, but what that will be, I'm not sure. Sorry, I might have misheard your question because I got temporarily, my mind wandered for a second to the previous comment.
All right. Would you like to comment anything else?
Not especially. I will say that, if there are no more questions or comments, that any of the students who might want to get in touch, I'd be happy to provide you with some more suggestions for reading, or if you want to share your thoughts more privately, or your comments and questions, I would be delighted to hear from you. So you can find me on the university website or via my own website, which is basically just my name.com. So I'd love to hear from you.
Yes, the website is here. I'm sharing with the students. It's in the screen. So thank you a lot, Professor Nomi Claire Lazar, for accepting the invitation very kindly, and to be here with us today. It was a very provocative class, and it was perfect to debate with what we are studying during this course, states of exception in theory and practice, with your class and with other talks that we are listening during this course, and the texts that we are reading. I hope the next time you come to Brazil, and it will be a pleasure to receive you here in Brazil. I say thank you again for the presence here, and I would like to inform the students that our next special class with a special guest will be next week on Tuesday. We will receive Professor Jorge Gonzalez Racome, that will talk about political ideas and states of exception in 20th century Colombia. Well, so after that, the website of Professor Nomi Claire Lazar is on the screen, and I say thank you to you, Professor, and to everyone that is with us. Thank you a lot for everything, and have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your attention, everyone, and for the invitation.